My guest this week is Hal Hershfield, Professor of Marketing, Behavioural Decision Making and Psychology at UCLA's Anderson School of Management, where he has won numerous awards for his teaching and research. His research on future selves has been published in media outlets including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Atlantic, in prestigious business, psychology, and science journals, and in the Harvard Business Review, Scientific American, and Psychology Today. Hal's book, Your Future Self: How to Make Tomorrow Better Today, was published in June this year by Little Brown Spark Publishers. And in it, Hal confronts the issue that while we would all like the best possible future for ourselves, we often fail to make decisions that would truly make that a reality. Carol Dweck, who introduced us to the concept of a growth mindset, says Hal's book helps us grow into the people we eventually want to be. Welcome to the business of being brilliant, Hal.
Hey, thank you, Helen. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, me too. I absolutely loved reading your book for a whole host of reasons. And I guess I'm particularly interested in it because, and in your work generally, because I'm quite intrigued by how we can make better choices or habits or decisions at home and at work that I guess help us lead the kind of life we really want to lead, and to have kind of more enjoyable, sustainable careers. And I guess that all boils down to how we essentially spend our time today and tomorrow, and whether today we are doing things that help us be the person we want to be in the future and live the life we want to have in the future. And that's kind of at the heart of your future self. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I like the way that you phrase that because I think one of the things that's implicit in the way that you're describing things there is that the things that we do today, the decisions that we make today, of course, add up. And they add up over time to sort of make us turn into the people that we ultimately become, right? And so, the
Yeah.
version I am today is a sum of all the decisions I made in the past, and the version of me in a year and 5 years will be a sum of all the decisions that I'm making, each day along the way between now and then.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. And we're going to get a little bit into this idea of kind of multiple selves
Hmm.
and some of the things we get wrong when we're thinking about ourselves today, and how we can perhaps address that to kind of have the future me's that we want to have.
Right.
So we'll get a bit more into kind of some of the ideas and advice in your book. But I wanted to ask a quick question first, because your work and your book is about the notion of mental time travel. And as I was thinking about our conversation, that got me wondering, what is your favorite time travel book or film? I was really curious to ask you that.
Oh man, that's such a good question. Um, the My favorite time travel book is called This Time Tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
It's actually relatively new. It's by Emma. What's her name? Emma Straub, and it's a brilliant book about like a woman's relationship with her father and sort of going back and in time and again. And I think it just takes, there's so many takes on time travel, and it just takes those classic sort of notions and tropes and just it makes them a little bit more colorful and vivid and really quite beautiful. It's relatively new, so maybe I'm being biased, but oh, I thought it was such a lovely book.
Oh, that's a great recommendation. I've not read it, so I'm really intrigued to read it. And in thinking about this question, I was thinking, what would I say? And actually, I wanted to test if you've read a book that I absolutely love, which is kind of around time travel as well, called The Anomaly by Hervé Letellier.
No, I
So
haven't actually.
he's a French author, very celebrated French author.
Yeah, no, I've heard of him. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's available in the English, and it's about a plane that inexplicably flies through a storm and inexplicably duplicates into two identical planes with two identical sets of passengers. One
Oh, that's
lands
great.
when it's planned, the other lands a couple of months later, and it's how everybody reacts with that to that, and also about how each self meets its other half, and what they do
Oh,
about that meeting.
that's so good. I love like spinning out all the ideas there. That's fantastic. I love it.
Yeah, yeah.
I
So
love
there we go. Two cracking book recommendations to
it.
start off for listeners. So can you tell us a little bit how you approach in your research and your work this idea of mental time travel and why it's important and useful to us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, first, mental time travel is really the idea that we can think ahead to different times. We can think back on times. We can do this in, by the way, really complicated ways. We can think ahead and then imagine how we'll feel at some future time thinking back to now, right? This gets complex quickly. Um, it's important. And the reason that I um, study it is because it's sort of at the heart of so many of the decisions that we make, because so many of our choices have consequences both now and later. And to some extent, by strengthening our mental time travel muscles, if you will, um, we can try to get a little bit of a better grasp on the decisions that we're making, with a little bit of a better sense of how will those decisions impact us, in the days, weeks, months, years, to come. Um, but if we focus solely on the sort of the nature of the decision itself and fail to consider the sort of time travel aspect, uh, that's when I think we get into trouble with decision making, generally speaking.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess it's a hard thing for us to do because I'm thinking primarily in our kind of work environments because we're faced with a lot of decisions every day and
Hmm.
the world of work is so fast and everything's done kind of now and also quite short termist. Quite a lot of businesses operate on quite short term timeframes unless you say you're in oil and gas and thinking about 25-year investments and things. So I guess it doesn't come naturally to think about each time we're faced with a decision about how's that going to play out for me and perhaps for others over the longer term.
I mean, it doesn't come naturally because, like you said, we're so oriented toward the short term, and that's of course the time period that we're in, and so of course all of the decisions that we make right now, we're feeling them right now. Um, and yet, if pushed or if given the opportunity to think a little bit more long term, we can of course do that, right? So it's not as if my research or other people's research tries to get people to do something that they never do. It's
Okay.
really trying to strengthen a ability that we already have.
Yeah, like as you said, growing that muscle, making it a bit more
Yes.
practiced and equipped.
Yeah.
So let's get into the notion of your future self.
Mm.
One of the questions you tackle in the book is future me the same person as current me, or is it
Hmm.
a am I somehow different? Are they
Hmm.
different people? Could you explain the answer to that?
Yeah. It's of course complicated, right? Because there's a
Yeah.
variety of ways of looking at it. So one of the ways that I look at it in the book and in my research is just simply how we think of our own future selves. And it turns out that from a research perspective, we often consider our future selves as if they are other people. Now, this is an analogy, of course. I think it gets tricky to sort of spin this out too far, but for instance, some research has found that we're likely to adopt the third person perspective when we think of our distant selves. It almost seems like another person in a scene, or we say he or she or they for a future self. Whereas, if you ask me what am I doing today, I wouldn't say, well, he is going to go, on a run later. It's like, no, that's I, that's
Yeah.
me, right? We've found on a brain level, future selves look more like other people. And so, the notion here, or the sort of, the question that you ask, are they the same? Are they different? Same and different is really complicated, but I think on some sort of, simplistic level, our future selves may seem like separate people from us. Now, they can be very similar to who we are now, in the same way that my spouse is a separate person, but our interests have melded over time, and in some ways we're very similar. In some ways, of course, we're very, very different. But that sort of analogy, I think, can be applied to the future self as well. They
Yeah.
are separate, or we perceive them as separate.
Yeah. So there may be some aspects of ourself that endures and remain the same. It might be our
Hmm.
sense of morality, as you say in the book, or
That's right.
certain big personality traits. But equally, we do evolve as individuals, and our tastes change, and our preferences and ambitions change.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I remember being a teenager, and my dad would come home with these sort of like crime thriller books, and I was like, Dad, why are you wasting your time on this? This is, there's so much great literature out there. And then at some point I realized, oh, he was really tired. And he wanted something to read that sort of like, was an escape. And, anytime I pick up sort of an escapist novel now, I think, I was such a jerk to my dad when I was a teenager. Like I should have just, and so those are preferences of mine that have changed over time in ways that I couldn't have anticipated because I didn't know
Yeah.
what the experience of being a tired adult would be like.
Yeah.
when I was a
Yeah. You're making me laugh because I'm thinking of that kind of quite common experience whereby we find ourselves kind of as we get older in our lives saying things that remind us of things that a parent might have said to us that we used to really bug us when we were younger, and we're like, oh my god, I am turning into my mother, or turning into
Yeah,
my father, and that gives me that sense of I've just kind of somehow time traveled.
100%. Yes, we talk about this all the time because my wife always jokes that her dad, my father-in-law, would always say, you're making a big deal out of a little deal. And she said it was the most infuriating thing when I was a kid. And then we've had this moment with our own kids when she said, "Oh my God, I was so tempted to say, why are you doing this? It's just a small." So you have to sort of fight that urge.
Yeah, do you give in and say it, or do you like resist?
I will never tell.
so so when we're thinking about current me, what are the things that we do that get in the way of making good decisions for our
Hmm.
future self? Because you say in the book that actually there are some things that we kind of get wrong that mean we don't make decisions in the best interests of our future
Yeah.
self. Can you
Yeah,
unpack
I
that a
can
little
elaborate.
bit?
So there's a variety of different ways that we can make mistakes. One of which is that we get overly anchored on our feelings right now, um, and that makes sense in a way because I said it earlier too. This is the time period that we live in. Of course, we're sort of anchored on what's happening right now. But when we get overly anchored on our feelings in the moment, what can happen is that we don't do enough work to think ahead, to the future. So we're sort of like just sort of succumbing to whatever's happening right now. Um, we can also, go a step further. We can take those same feelings and tell ourselves that we're making a decision for our future self, but just really over project how I'm feeling right now onto my future self. The classic example, I go to grocery shopping when I'm hungry.
Yeah.
I think I need a lot more food until later in the week I realize I have all this food that I'm not, that I don't need. That's sort of a silly example, but you can think of times when like this where I'm making some decision for my future self, and I say, well, I feel this way now. I may continue to feel that way in the future. When in fact, I may not. My preferences might change over time. There's other times also we make a mistake by simply um, not fully planning out what the future will look like. We tell ourselves, "Yeah, I'm thinking ahead," but we don't. We don't really. Procrastination is like my favorite example of that. I say, "Oh, I'll do that. I'll do that next week. I'll take care of that thing tomorrow, whatever." And I'm not really thinking deeply about the fact that if I don't want to do that thing right now, future me isn't going to want to do it either.
Yeah.
So those are a couple different ways, but they all lead to mistakes. And when I say mistakes, it's that we end up at some future and we regret the decisions we make. I say, why did I leave it? Why did I leave it until right now? um, to start prepping for a class that I have to teach next week when I know that it would have been a lot better had I started 3 weeks ago. So this is that's just a hypothetical example, but
Yeah.
That's those are some of the times when we can really sort of make an error, make a mistake in planning.
Yeah. Okay, so overemphasize or putting too much weight on our emotions and letting that guide us too much, and not really valuing, I guess, our future time as much as today. Because by the point you were making about procrastinating, it's quite easy, and I speak to a lot of people who struggle with procrastination,
Hmm.
or who think that our time tomorrow or next week is, a lot more flexible and expandable than it actually is. It's somehow this magical, amorphous, stretchy bundle of time that can accommodate an endless amount of things that we could never fit into a 24-hour day.
That's exactly right. It's like, and I think everybody's probably guilty of this. There will be times where I say, well, here are the things I want to get done this weekend morning before I have to take the kids to whatever birthday party or sporting event. And I get through two of the five things. And it's like, what was I thinking? Like, how could I possibly have thought that I would have been able to do all those things
Yeah.
in that period of time? You fool yourself into thinking that you'll be much more efficient and that time will last longer in the future than it actually does.
Yeah. And this is a confession here. I've noticed this really weird thing with my concept of time is that I can be quite realistic about how I'm going to spend a morning, how much stuff's going to take. Quite pragmatic about the afternoon. I know that's my less productive time, so I do
Hmm.
the more taxing brain stuff in the morning. But I have this real block on kind of middle of the daytime, which kind of, broadly speaking, 12 till 2. And I'll just mentally pile things into that, thinking, oh yeah, in that little bit of time I can do these 40 things. And it's like if I thought about even one of them, I'd realize that would take at least half an hour to an hour.
Right,
So how could I possibly be
right,
contemplating more than two or three things?
right,
But it's like
right.
this weird kind of time that I just can't mentally get to grip with.
Yeah, no, and that's, it's funny because I feel this, I do the same thing. And the problem, the time when it becomes really problematic is when if you were to be stopped and say, is this realistic? You'd probably say, wait, no, it's not, because this, right? You're
Yeah.
sophisticated enough to know that. And yet, it happens again and again.
Yeah. So, what are some of the um, approaches we can use, or any advice you can give
Mm,
for helping us counteract some of
sure.
those weaknesses we tend to fall prey to?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I would say, number one is to try to engage in time travel that's more vivid. And what I mean by that is it's really easy for us to think about the future in these sort of surface level, almost abstract ways. So, when you think about the 40 things the 40 things you're going to do in 2 hours, my bet is that you are probably you're thinking of what those 40 things are, but not in some deep way and not in some vivid way. I'm not calling you out, of course. I do, I do
No,
the
call
same.
me out. You're
Right, yeah.
right.
But if you were to take any one of those and say, okay, what's actually involved in that task? Let me try to like picture doing it. What are some of the interruptions that could occur? I think it can become apparent right away that one thing that I'd allocated 5 minutes to may actually realistically take 25 or 30, right? And so one of the sort of first techniques that I suggest when we're trying to make better decisions over time is to do whatever we can to enhance the vividness of both the context and our own future selves. So, if it's a really long term decision, write a letter to your future self and write a letter back from your future self, right? How will that version of me be feeling in 10, 20, 30 years, whatever the time frame is, that we're talking about. Um, More, shorter term, it's, literally the question of if I step into the shoes of that version of me, whether it's my tomorrow morning self or my afternoon self, how will he feel you know if I right now do this thing or don't do this thing? I mean, this is relevant for me a lot when it comes to um both health stuff and productivity. Like there have been times where I say I'm going to work out in the morning and then I'm too tired and I say I'll do it later, and then I'll stop and I'll say, what what will I really feel this afternoon? Like, and if that's hard to picture, like, what did I feel yesterday afternoon? I wasn't that awake. I wasn't that energized to work out. So that's probably not going to happen. Productivity wise, I think we've probably all had the moment where I say, I've got an important thing to do. I've got something urgent to do. The urgent thing is easier in a way because it's like responding to 10 emails or whatnot. Oh, I'll just do that. And then I'll stop and say, well, how am I going to feel at the end of this day or the end of this work week if all that I can point to is that I, got my inbox a little clearer, but didn't really take care of the bigger thing that I wanted to do? And often the answer isn't, it's not a good answer. So
Yeah.
maybe I could change things around, or allocate my time differently moving forward or whatever it may be. So some of the solutions here are really just doing the exercise of stepping into the shoes of our future selves, to make it easier to to make those time travel trips a little bit smoother, if you will.
Yes, that makes sense. And I love the example you quote in the book. I think you said it was from an episode of Jerry Seinfeld or something, where he's talking about Evening Guy and how
Yeah, yeah.
he never makes. Well, I'll let you explain it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
A
Seinfeld has
morning
this great
guy.
one where he talks about, night guy, morning guy. And he says, that night guy stays up too late because it's morning guy's problem, essentially, to not, to not have enough sleep. And then he says, but when you're morning guy, you're upset at night guy because you're like, why did that guy stay up so late?
Yeah.
Um, and then he has a solution. He says the only thing that, what does he say? The only thing that morning guy can do is to try to oversleep often enough so that day guy loses his job and then night guy has no money to go out anymore, which, is like a perfect solution of multiple selves, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, that was a really funny example. Really good. And you talked about kind of writing letters to your future self. I thought there's a wonderful idea, and but also we can do that for our children or loved ones as well. And also, you're saying it's used in a work and academic context as well. You can invite, for example, new graduates to write letters, I guess, thinking ahead in their careers about the things that they'd like to have looked back on, and that might
Yeah,
help with
and
things like thinking about what's important to them in their career, for example.
exactly. And I would say that one of the keys there is, not just writing the letter to, but also, doing that time travel trip of stepping into the shoes of your future self and then writing the letter back. And, you know, the reason that I like that, and that's a technique that two researchers, Yuta Shishima and Ann Wilson, devised. The reason I like it is because I think it really forces somebody to not just get anchored on right now and look ahead, but to time travel forward and look back. And I think
Yeah.
that's really helpful in tapping into the emotions that our future self might feel.
Yes. And for people who are listening, who might be juggling really full
Hmm.
workloads and full home lives, maybe responsibilities outside of the workplace as well. Um, yeah, a lot of them say to me, it's just there's so much urgent stuff. I know I need to focus on the important stuff, but I feel like it's so hard to block out time to do that because I something always comes up that eats into
Hmm.
that time and etc. Um, how would you suggest people deal with that difficulty? Are you advocating a fairly frequent or even split between thinking about the here and now and the immediate versus thinking about the long term? What's the best way to approach that
Yeah,
difficulty?
it's such a good question. I mean, so the very first thing I would say is, have some self compassion and self forgiveness, right? So, it's like really easy to beat ourselves up because we're falling short of the things that we said we wanted to do.
Mm,
And, you know, that's not really fair to our present selves, right? So much of my book is about, being fairer to our future selves. But in the end, I really do have a lot about creating that balance because if we're sort of constantly making ourselves, if we're constantly holding ourselves to a higher bar that we're never going to reach, that what sort of life is that, right? And I look, I'm in this bucket now where it's like career, kids, family, all that stuff, and it's like impossible to do anything impossible to do anything at the level that I want to do it at, right? Whether it's at work or at home or whatever. And I know this is a common experience. And I also recognize that there's gender differences in this too, because there's different expectations um, uh, put out there. So so one first step is to sort of have some compassion about your ability to do certain things, and like recognize that some are going to drop. And then also, to some extent, I think there needs to be like a bigger conversation of like, what are the arenas that are most important to me? Where am I okay with some things dropping for now? Right.
Mm.
If I say, well, right now I'm having a hard time connecting with friends, maybe that's going to have to go on the back burner for a little bit of time until I can sort of clear my plate and, get the stuff at work done and then come back to it. But of course, the problem is when I only when I always ignore one bucket, and then months and years go by and I say, oh, I haven't done anything. Your question though is a really good one of what's that sort of balance. I don't think it should be 50-50 between present and future, because um so much of our time is spent in the present, right? And eventually we get to that future self, but we have to first look out for what's happening right now. I'll give you an analogy. There's you often hear of these anecdotal cases of people saving for the future because they know they're supposed to save, but they have credit card debt, or they have very high interest debt right now. Sometimes it makes sense because you want to have the habit of saving for the future, but also it may there are other times when it makes sense to rebalance that so that I can pay off some of my debt now and then eventually have more money to save for the future. In the same way with time, if I'm ignoring right now because I say, well, I have to do these things for the future, that's a problem too, because then I'm just sort of compounding my problems. I don't know if that makes sense or if
Yeah.
that's too abstract, but I think there's no like one balance. Like I wouldn't say to you, well, make it 25% future and 75% present. Obviously, this is all idiosyncratic.
Yeah.
Um, but the point being that I think we have to make an assessment of what's happening in our lives right now and pay attention to some of those problems and do the things we have to do for that right now. But at the same time, it shouldn't be 100 and 0, right? It shouldn't be
Yes.
that we're all focused on right now, or conversely, all focused on the future, which is rarer still, but could happen.
Yes. Yes, that makes sense. And you make the lovely point in your book that we should try and find, I think you call it the glimmers of joy, even in the most challenging of times that we're faced with. And I think that's your point, that actually it's not healthy and rewarding to live life always thinking about the future, always working towards our future, life, because, we don't even know if we're going to get there for a start.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
so actually, whatever today looks like, however easy or challenging that might feel, we can still look for those moments of enrichment and enjoyment and fun and spontaneity, or whatever, even if that's a micro moment of it, and just really cherish those. And yeah.
That's exactly right. And I think the it's easy to sometimes put our blinders on, and so much of my book is about right making decisions now that benefit us in the future. But there are these times when I think we all fall prey to this mistake of telling ourselves that we're doing something for the future and we sort of ignore the present, right?
Yeah.
I have to work really hard right now, stay up late and get work done, or for me, I'm on my phone dealing with something and my kids are right there, and it's like, oh, they're like not going to be young forever, and
Yeah.
what am I missing by doing that? And I think we do a disservice to our future selves by sort of uh, by telling ourselves that we're working for them, but in reality we're missing the present. And then
Yeah.
what sort of life does that add up to over
Yeah,
time?
that's a great reminder and a great way of reframing, or looking at it differently. And a final question that I often ask a different way to my guests. I usually ask them kind of what unfulfilled ambition do they still have? But I would ask you, what would you like your future self in, I don't know, 10, 20 years' time? You can choose, kind of be saying to you now.
Yeah. this is such a good question. There's a new distinction in psychology. So Aaron Westgate and Shigeru Oishi have this wonderful paper where they say when we think about our lives, you can think about a happy life and a meaningful life and a psychologically rich life. And a psychologically rich life is one that's, well, it sounds, it is just what it sounds like. It's one that's rich in experiences, doesn't have to be all good, but it's full, and it contains meaning and happiness as well. And so I think, I love your question, but I think if I were to sort of zoom ahead 20 years from now, and I'd probably be close to thinking about retirement, at least in the next couple of years. I would want that version of me to look back and say it's been rich. There's been a richness in both sort of my family, or not both, but in the sort of social, family, and work spheres. Um, I know that's pretty abstract, but it's like hard to get like concrete, like what that actually what that actually looks like. But I would want it to be an experience of richness.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful answer, a wonderful philosophy. And it's been so enriching talking to you today and unpacking some of these ideas and all the advice you're sharing around, how we can look differently at some of the things we struggle with, like procrastination or, short-term decision making, or the annoying habits we fall into that we know aren't in our best interests for ourselves tomorrow or next month
Right.
or next year or further ahead. And I think I'm mostly going to hold on to two pieces of advice you've given. One about actually just enjoy engaging in more vivid ways about your
Yeah.
future self. And I like what appeals to me is the kind of creativity that we can enjoy in doing that, whether that's writing or other ways. And also your point about start with self-compassion. It's a really good reminder when
Yeah.
we're juggling work
Yeah.
and family lives, and trying to be the best, manager, colleague, client, whatever, partner, parent,
Hmm.
child, we can really forget that
That's
important
right.
point. So
That's
thank you
right.
for reminding us, and thank you for being a brilliant guest.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you so much for having me.